So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carmen Carpentieri, and I'm one of the executive committee of the European Radon Association. We are waiting a couple of minutes more to let the people in the webinar, and I share a short presentation to introduce this webinar. So we are already 88 people. Number, sorry, is increasing. I guess you can see my presentation. So I just start. So I would like to welcome all of you to the second webinar organized by European Radon Association, ERA. And the theme of this webinar is concerning assessing non-cancer health effects on radon and particle radioactivity. And our thanks go to our speaker, Professor Petros Koutrakis, Professor of Environmental Sciences at the School of Public Health of Harvard University. Before to start, I just would like to say a few words about the European Radon Association. The association was founded in 2013. The main purpose was to be a platform to exchange information and to give the opportunity to radon experts to do strong networking. And is addressed to all the radon sectors, so companies, research facilities, and authorities that can compare their experiences on radon. So European Radon Association is a non-profit international organization and it is registered under the Belgian law. Just few words about the objectives of the association. The main objective is to assist in reducing the health burden from radon in Europe. There are specific objectives that to reach this big one. So to promote public awareness. So in the 2015, one of the main things done was to promote in 2015 the European Radon Day, that is the 7th of November. There are on the web page of the association and on YouTube radon related video. Then to provide communication networks for the professionals and other relevant group. And among this activity, there are this new activity about that is webinars. As I told you, this is the second one. But we have also website, ERA Radon Week, and a journal dedicated, that is Journal of European Radon Association, JERA. Another objective is to encourage the development of quality standard in indoor radon metrology, remediation, prevention, and control technology, to contribute also to education and training in all the aspects of radon risks, from the measurement to the remediation. And in this, we assist in the organization of radon conferences. And last but not the least, we serve as a pool of experts and a consultative body for international agency. And there is a strong collaboration with the International Atomic Energy Agency with training and webinars. And we financially support the meetings rooms. More information about the European Radon Association and how to sign for membership are available at the webpage www.radoneurope.org. But before to start, I would like to remind you that from October 11th to October 15th, there will be the European Radon Week that will be held in Fribourg in Switzerland. It's a collection of 4 different events. So there will be 2 workshops. One is the ERA workshop on international collaboration on radon, and Europe First Regional Workshop, the General Assembly of the Association, and finally the rooms meeting. And I'm glad to tell everybody that finally we have our first face-to-face event. The registration is still open till the 30th of September, and the link is available on the event page of the the ERA web page. Before to start, I would like to remind you that are strongly invited to ask questions. To do so, please use the QA button in the at the bottom of the screen. Bern and Laura, that will help me in this webinar, will collect the questions and if necessary combine them and propose them to Professor Koutrakis. And I would like to remind you that the webinar is recorded and it will be available on the ERA website as soon as possible. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Professor Koutrakis for his a webinar on assessing non-cancer health effects on radon and particle radioactivity. Enjoy.
Thanks, Carmen, for the introduction. You need to exit, yeah?
Yes.
And I will share my screen. Okay. And I minimize this. Okay. Again, thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks for the association that they invited me to give me this opportunity to reach out to the European colleagues. My name is Petros, and I am originally from Greece, Crete, where I am right now. So I'm in the middle of nowhere. So if you lose me, I have another option to reach out to you, so don't panic. Thanks. I would like to thank Jose Luis for organizing this and putting this presentation webinar together. I originally thought to talk about assessing non-cancer health effects of radon and particle radioactivity, but I had so much stuff just for the radon, so I decided to talk about radon today. And here is a very brief outline of my presentation. I will just introduce environmental radiation, a little bit talk about radon, exposure assessment, because that's very important to do health studies. I'll talk about mortality studies, and I will then talk about health outcomes and biomarkers. And I will close with some implications and talk about research needs and opportunities. We are bombarded by radiation that can come from the Earth, from the atmosphere outside, the cosmic and solar radiation. And also it can come directly to our body, or through inhalation. We can inhale radionuclides, or dermally we can be exposed, although some of this radiation cannot penetrate the human skin. And finally, we can be exposed to ingestion. So unfortunately, despite the fact that we have been suspecting that all these types of radiation, they have serious environmental health impacts, there is very little done in this area. And most of this is done by people in the field of occupational health, in the field of radiation biology, and very, very little in terms of the environmental exposures. So over the last 4 years, we have started digging into this field, and we have about I can classify our studies in 3 groups. The first is the radon, which is very clear for you. The second is particle radioactivity. We all know that PM 2.5 has serious health effects, and we have been trying for the last 30 years to identify the chemical, physical, or biological properties that they are responsible for these effects. And to date, actually, the most robust exposure we have to justify, which is associated with all these effects, is the mass. We had a hypothesis that we still have, and we believe in it, that radionuclides, whether they come from radon or from cosmic radiation, they can produce alpha radiation that when we inhale the particles, this radiation can be very harmful to the human body and can explain the total or in part the toxicity of particles. So that's our hypothesis, and we have been working on this the last 4 years. And finally, there is another whole area of research we do with my colleague my colleagues at Harvard, and this is about solar and cosmic radiation, the direct effects. Now, what we do, we took air pollution studies for which we have developed cohorts. We have biological data, we have epidemiological data, we have exposure assessment, and we try to take these air pollution studies and introduce new exposure metrics, whether it's the radon or the particle radioactivity or the solar radiation. And we can take advantage and really do a lot within a short period of time and in a very cost-effective way. So in terms of the publications and the work we have done, I would say that the more publications we have done are in the areas of particle radioactivity and solar and cosmic radiation, and less radon. The problem with radon is we don't really have good exposure data, and that's where we need to really make an effort. So today I'm presenting just a part of these studies, and I will focus only radon. Now, there are, in these studies, we find, not in all of them, but in many of them, interactions between radiation and air pollution. And we have 2 hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that solar radiation or terrestrial radiation can really make people susceptible to air pollution. And I don't have the time to go through the mechanisms, but there are many biological mechanisms that they can explain this hypothesis, support this hypothesis. And the second is that radiation can really enhance the toxicity of air pollution. And a very simple example is we can have the radon progeny that they can attach to particles, and then we have the particles. So there are 2 possible hypothesis mechanisms, and I think both actually are going on. And what we study is a combination of toxicity and susceptibility. Now, from the radon point of view, radon really represents the large fraction of exposure, of the total exposure to natural radiation. And much of the radiation cannot really penetrate our skin, but radon we can inhale as a gas or its progeny, attached or unattached to particles. And this really can be a serious exposure. So in order to do the studies I will show you, we need to do exposure assessment. And we have different metrics to do exposure assessment. As I said, the data are very sparse. We can use radon for county, like special information about radon, or we can use data by companies that they have measured homes as part of real estate transactions in the United States, for instance. We can take particles and we can measure the alpha or beta or gamma radiation that is emitted by the particles on a filter. You could be surprised that you can have filters collected 20 years ago, and you put them under the spectrometer and you can still find radiation coming off. We can measure specific radionuclides. The lead-210 has a half-life of 22 plus years, and so we can always measure it, and we can measure its progeny, bismuth-210 or polonium-210. And finally, we have very good biomarkers for radon exposure, lead-210, for instance, and I will show you results from biomarker studies. The beauty of the radon exposure assessment is that we do have biomarkers. And in the case of ambient particles, once we inhale the particles, there is very little we can really find inside the human body that we can pinpoint as an exposure to ambient particles. Because we have ingestion, and many of the elements we ingest, they can come from, from soil or for food or etc. So, but in the case of biomarkers, we really have a better handle when it comes to radon. So in the United States, most of the studies we have done, not me, but many people before us, since the 80s, they have used this special data. They don't change by time. By county, we have about 3,006 counties in the United States. And these measurements are based on early surveys by EPA, and then the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, they took it and they developed a Bayesian model, and they estimate the exposures that us and others have used over the past. But again, these do not change by time. I was pleased to participate in the first ERA, European Radon Association workshop, where the GRC presented the European Radon Atlas. This has about a resolution of 10 by 10 kilometers, covers most of Europe. And again, this does not change by time, okay? It's special, it's based on geological information and based on measurements done by different member states and some modeling. In Europe, we have a couple of countries that they do have better data than the GRC data. It's the group from the Tropical Public Health School in Switzerland. They develop, again, a special model based on many measurements, considering that we have a small country, and they consider many, many predictors, and which really makes the predictability of the model very good. And when they finished their whole model, they found that over 16% of the people in Switzerland were exposed to levels above the WHO guidelines of the 100 becquerels per cubic meter. Now, when we start trying to publish our mortality studies, I'm going to show you, people really, the reviewers were very excited. Oh, this is the first time we see non-cancer effects at these large populations. However, we don't like your studies because we don't believe that you can use exposures that they don't vary by time. And once you don't have exposures that they do not vary by time, then you can have a lot of special confounding. And from there, the discussion really can go down the hill. So we thought very hard and started to give some importance to the temporal variability of radon. And to do that, you need many data, and you need many predictors. So we are doing now many more other parts of the United States, but the first part we started was the New England area, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, parts of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and where we took many measurements, 500,000, if I remember, measurements from the Spruce Environmental company, one of the biggest companies, that the commercial companies, that they collect data as part of transactions. I don't know if this is a requirement in Europe, but in the United States, it's pretty customary to check the house for radon, and if exceeds more than 4 picocuries per liter, which is 120 becquerel, so a little bit more, 150, you need to remediate the house. So we took all this data, and then we took hundreds of predictors, geologic, house characteristics, GIS, meteorology, etc., pollution, etc. And then we took about 9 different machine learning techniques, different models, and we did predictions using each of these models. And then we took all the models and we did an ensemble of models. And based on that ensemble, we predicted concentrations by zip code, which is few kilometers by few kilometers or even less, and month. We couldn't go less than a month. And using this spatial temporal data, we conducted biological studies and cohort studies I'm going to show you later on. And these are the data we got for the first paper we wrote for New England. And as I said, we are collecting data for the rest of the United States now. So what we learned from these early spatial temporal models? Well, that in Massachusetts, for instance, that on average, the zip code concentration was about 82.6 becquerels per cubic meter, and with a standard deviation of 34 becquerels per cubic meter. Also, what we learned was that in the summer, the levels are lower, which we knew anyway, because for many years, people measure indoor radon, and of course, during the summer, we have higher ventilation, and therefore we have less ozone, less radon. However, what we learned here, it was about the yearly trends. If you asked me before this model, before these results, what do you think about the changes, the trends over time? I would have thought that, especially in Massachusetts, where people are very proactive, very educated, I would expect that as time passes, most of the homes will be mitigated and the trends will go down. And actually, that's not the case, as you can see here, whether we don't see trends or we see an increase. And we looked a little bit more carefully, and we talked to people, and we read some other papers that they came from Canada. For instance, there was a very nice review paper. And we saw that, that we knew, of course, that homes are getting very tight because of the energy consumption concerns. And also the homes are getting bigger, and bigger footprint of the basement indicates higher intake of radon within the house structure. So this is something we need to keep in mind. So now, as I said, we don't have many radon measurements, and we'll never have many, and we try to use the data we have. And one of the criticisms for this model, and I like to share the criticism because many of you will go out and do studies, and I think it's a good idea to know what kind of issues will come up. And one of the concern from the reviewers again was, okay, you have now a spatial temporal model, but most of these measurements were done in the basement because that's the requirement in the United States. We went back to our data and we found 4 states in the United States where the Spruce, again, environmental gave us measurements where they had simultaneous living room and basement measurements. And what we found that there is a very strong relationship. Of course, the levels in the basement are higher, but in general, the basement is a good predictor of the living room exposures. And we can now, using this calibration, to include in the model. So, so far, good news. Now, we have done many studies in the past, and indoor studies and outdoor studies, and we have many filters. And there was a paper by New York University or New York in collaboration with the local government there. And they had published a paper where they said that you can really take a mold filter and you can measure the radiation that comes from that filter. And that is mostly related to the particle radioactivity when the sample was collected. So when you collect the sample, like for instance, EPA, they wait 4 days until the hot stuff, the short-lived radionuclides go away, and then you measure it. So now, if you measure the beta or alpha activity at the end of those 4 days, and then you measure it in 20 years, you can predict after 20 years what was the exposure after the 4 days. And you can do that by just measuring alpha and beta, and then the decay, take the decay curve, and you can calculate. So what we did, we took this method and we published a paper about particle radioactivity and how to validate the method. But what we did, we start taking filters from old studies and try to, especially the indoor studies, try to recreate a retrospective exposure to radon. So now we can do many studies we did not have radon back then, but now we can take the filters and do the measurements. So this is what I just said, the uranium goes to radium, and radium becomes a gas, and we have this short, which goes within hours or days, and after we have the long. So I will call this, if I take a filter right away, real time, fresh filter, and measure the activity, that will be the long-lived alpha or beta activity. If I wait 4 days or 40 years, I will measure the long-lived alpha or beta activity. And if we want to measure the hot stuff, the actual stuff, we can use electret filters, but also we develop a new method that I will share with you in a minute. And if we want to measure the long-lived activity, we can do this many years later and correct, and we have published this paper. So now, if I took the ratio of the long-lived, I have all filters from an old indoor study. So I take the filters after 10 years or 5 years, and I divide the activity of the indoor filters for a given house by the activity of the ambient filter. The ratio of this ratio is an indicator whether that home had high levels of indoor. If this ratio, for instance, is 2 or 1 or 1.5, that means that, in addition to what comes from outside, to particle radioactivity that comes outside, that house has radon. So we use this, as I will show you later, as a surrogate of the exposure to radon. Here is the, we have developed a continuous particle activity, short-lived activity. It's very useful, it's inexpensive, and we can really measure, these are two collocated, we use a filter, we have a chamber and scintillation cell, and we collect continuous, and we can record the radioactivity every few minutes. Now, if I compare the activity of the if I take filters from a house and measure, wait 4 days and measure this will be on the order of 1 to few millibecquerels per cubic meter. If I measure this directly during the sampling, then this will be on the order of 40 becquerels per cubic meter. This is going to be like 5,000 times more. Now, in our studies, and we have done a lot of ambient, I'm not going to talk about ambient, but just for the sake of this discussion, we have done many studies where we associated outdoor particle activity on mortality. And the effects we find are for becquerels per cubic meter. And people say, how can you kill people with millibecquerels per cubic meter? You don't, but what happened, this is just an indication of what was happening the day that people inhaled the particles. So that really, the energy, the activity we inhale real time to ambient particles is astronomical. So, and this shows inside the house, the oil color, the greenish color, is the radon, and the pars, which is a continuous short-lived activity, is the blue. And as you see that you can have activity inside the house, particulate activity, or the order of 40 and 50 becquerels per cubic meter, and that's a lot. Because radon, for instance, 40 becquerels, much of the radon will come out, but when the particles, they have 40 becquerels per cubic meter, that is going to stay in the lungs and it's going to go to the human body. So we also use nowadays small reliable sensors that we compare with the integrated. So now people can really, if they want, they can have sensors with $100 inside their homes that they can be enabled by Wi-Fi and be connected directly. And I think in Europe, actually, Europe is better in terms of micro monitoring as compared to the United States. I think there are many countries now in Europe that they have real-time radon measurements. So I talked about biomarkers, and here is we took cadavers in Sao Paulo with our colleagues Paul Saltiva and his team, and we measure lead-210 or polonium. This is levels. I think I cannot see. I think it's polonium-210. And in the lungs, we found 2.3 becquerels per kilogram dry tissue. In the brain, we found 3 times that. And this is really serious because once this gets inside the brain, there is no clearance as compared to the clearance we have in the lungs. And this can shoot alpha particles, radiation inside the brain. And there are some people, including myself, who believe that brain aging and damage really can be related to inhalation of radon or radon progeny. So now let's go to health effects. The first study we did was in the northeastern United States, which covers 70 million people. Background, very little was known about the non-malignant and non-respiratory effects of radon. And even the evidence for non-respiratory radon effects is scarce and inconsistent, and most of the studies found no clear association with non-respiratory mortality. A paper by Turner on the American Chemical Cancer Society, it's a big cohort, it's a national cohort, found positive associations with people with chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, but no evidence for an association with no respiratory mortality. Again, there was a collaborative study, meta-analysis of 11 cohorts among minors concluded that mortality from cancers other than the lung cancer is unlikely to be caused by radon. So most of the studies have investigated occupational exposures. Very little is done for non-cancer, and very little is done for epidemiological environmental studies, environmental exposures. So we published this paper 2 years ago, the Environment International. We took 63 counties in the Middle Atlantic and Northeastern, about 70 million people, follow-up of 13 years, 14 years. We had 42 million person years of Medicare beneficiaries. This is a huge data set. Whatever results you get from this kind of size, you take it seriously. And beneficiaries, we don't have national healthcare systems in the United States. Now we start having the Obamacare, but it's not fully implemented, and there are issues. But for people who retire after 65, there is a national database, the Medicare, and this is where the data come. There are many more details, but I don't have the time. We applied Poisson survival analysis, and we controlled for exposures to radon and for PM2.5 because we know PM2.5 causes effects. And here what found for all people an increase of 0.61% of mortality per log IQR in the quantile range of radon. If you have COPD, is 1.7. If you have congestive heart failure, higher, the same. But you can see here, people with cardiometabolic problems, diabetes, the effect was considerably higher. And actually, if you see, here is the mortality for all, and then the no goes down to one something, yes for COPD and CHF, congestive heart failure. So definitely there is clear evidence that there are effects of mortality of radon. These are higher than the respective effects of particle PM2.5. In this study, we did not find an interaction. We did not find even an effect for PM2.5 in this study. And for people who cardiovascular and metabolic diseases, we found significantly higher risks. Then a previous study, which was published in 2018, we took about 100 plus cities in the United States. We studied the effects of PM2.5 on mortality, and then we took their risks, the effect estimates, and we meta-regressed them on the county radon, okay? What we found that radon significantly modifies the effects of PM2.5. For instance, if you live in an area that is below the 10th percentile of radon, for 10 micrograms per cubic meter of PM2.5, the mortality is 1.95. But if you live in a county where the radon is above the 90th percentile, this risk for the same 10 micrograms per cubic meter is almost double. So this is really important. So it's a clear evidence that radon really increases the toxicity of particles. And in fact, people living in areas with higher radon are less protected to ambient air pollution. So outcomes, if we saw this mortality data, we should really be able in controlled studies with cohorts where we do outcomes to see some evidence. If we cannot, then we cannot really support this hypothesis that radon causes non-cancer mortality. So these papers I'm going to present to you now are fresh. They are not published. They are about to be published, some of them. And the first analysis is about exhaled nitrogen oxide and radon in a panel of asthmatic children. We found that exhaled NO, which is an indicator of airway inflammation with high levels associated with asthma, exacerbations, and lung function decline. So for this study, we found we used 184 school children from the school inner study in Boston. It's an inner city study. The exposures of radon are not expected to be that high as compared to the rural areas. We had repeated measurements, and we dichotomized the radon below and above the 25th percentile, and the exposure window was about 2 months before we measured the exhaled nitrogen. And we controlled for seasonality, age, body mass index, and height. And what we found a positive association between exhaled nitrogen oxide and indoor, suggesting radon exposure might be an important environmental risk for airway inflammation. More importantly, for these kids, the same kids, we measured symptoms how many bad days you have the last 2 weeks. And the kids, they have a questionnaire that they note the number of days exacerbations of asthma. And this is very serious. If a child says that he has symptoms, that really affects medication, affects performance, school absentees, and etc. So we found that for radon, home radon, not school radon, was associated with an increase in the symptoms over the last 14 days. So these two studies really show significant effects on asthmatic children. And these exposures, these are not the 20 years exposures or the 30 years of exposures of radon for lung cancer, etc. These are young children exposed in limited time. And in fact, what we found is that the exposure over the last 2 months is related to their exacerbation. So these effects are quite transient, okay? They're not chronic. So then a couple of more studies where we study the effects of radon and the ratio of indoor-outdoor particle activity on lung function. And my colleague Eric Garshik, he has a cohort of COPD patients in Boston, where we had 144 participants. This study was done between 2012 and 2017. We had all archived filters, and of course, we have the health outcomes. We had 476 clinical observations of pulmonary function before and after giving people bronchodilator, the spray that you put in order to relax your lungs. So we measure the flow from their lungs before and after, and we call this PD and BD. And we use a generalized additive mixed effects models with random intercepts. And we controlled in the secondary analysis for black carbon and PM, because these are also predictors of lung function. And I'm going back to the ratio. You remember we used the ratio of indoor and outdoor long-living alpha as an indicator of having high radon in these people the week we did the health measurements. And also we use the sulfur ratio indoor-outdoor as an indicator of the home tightness, okay? So here's what we found. We found if we use as an exposure metric the outdoor long-lived alpha, we have no effects. If we use the indoor long-lived alpha, we have no effects. If we use the ratio of alpha indoors to outdoors, you remember this is an indicator of radon, we start seeing something for both the pre-bronchodilator and post-bronchodilator. And then if we take the homes that they had high ratios of alpha, but also they had low ventilation, which exacerbates the effects of radon, you can see that, especially here, the numbers, they go down, the effect is more, but the levels, the confidence intervals are larger and they cross zero because we have smaller number of homes, but still there is an indication. And actually this indication is more clear for the FEC, where we can see that if you live in a house that has high radon and is not well ventilated, you really have a serious problem, okay? So, and for the same study, again, for the COPD, we measure biomarkers of health effects, especially to cardiovascular diseases. You know, if we have cardiovascular mortality, and so we should really see some indication that radon can do some activity inside the human body. Again, we took the same cohort, and we took blood plasma, and we measure C-reactive protein, which is a circulatory marker that shows response to inflammation. we use VCAM, vascular cell adhesion molecule, is a protein that mediates the adhesion of white cells to vascular endothelium, producing plaque and producing atherosclerosis and chronic heart problems. And finally, IL-6, which is a pro-inflammatory cytokine. Again, we use this as independent as outcomes, and we use the same analysis. And here now on the left, we have the indoor long-lived alpha and the CRP levels in micrograms per liter. There is some indication, but not much. We have the ambient that does not make a thing. And here is the ratio, which is a surrogate of radon exposure. And you can see that there is a very significant increase in CRP for people who live in homes with high radon. And VCAM, as I said, it's very important for vascular diseases. We see a strong effect for the indoor alpha, not for the outdoor alpha, and effect for the indoor to outdoor ratio, which I said is an indication for radon. So I'm running out of time, and I'm going to just go through. The last thing I want to present is a study by my colleague, Stefania Papatheodorou. She studied residential exposure and hypertensive disorders. She took 1 million women pregnancies, births, deliveries in Massachusetts between 2001 and 2015. After doing some cleaning of the data, she ended up with 975,000 women. And we use our spatial temporal model by month and by zip code. We use a 0-1 indicator if a woman got hypertension after the 20th week of pregnancy and she did not have hypertension before, she will have a score of alpha 1. If not, it will have a score of 0. And from the 975,000 women, 3.7, this is a very serious number, got gestational hypertension. And the radon was not very high. And we found that for an IQR interquantile of radon, we had an increase of 15% in the odds of getting gestational hypertension. So think about this. If 36,000 women get hypertension during their pregnancy, which is a very bad thing to happen because it has many implications for the fetus and for the woman after, 15% of those, which would be like 5,000 women, got hypertension due to radon. Okay, that's a very high number. And also, Stefania took women less than 20 years because there was some knowledge that they are more susceptible. And she found that for each IQR of radon, there is a 38% increase in hypertension. This is a very serious number. So this study of 1 million people over is a first evidence that supports that indoor radon exposure causes systemic effects that warrant further investigation. And actually, Stefania has another study where she found particle radioactivity to cause gestational diabetes, which is another very bad disease. Now,
Professor,
yes.
You have a couple of minutes left.
Okay, that will be enough. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, that would be enough. We did a study with pregnant women. We measured the polonium-210 and lead-210 in the placenta from the side of the mother and the side of the child. The child is blue, the mother is red. And you can see supposedly the placenta has to protect, this concentration can be high, but this should be low because that's the side of the baby. And you can see that the placenta really provides very little protection to radon progeny. And closing remarks, 2 slides. We have strong evidence for non-cancer effects. This is an emerging field with no prior studies other than the lung cancer studies we have. We have used similar tools for air pollution, and there is evidence for potential interactions between radon and air pollution. I talked about the two hypotheses we have. There is evidence for cardiovascular effects. And now, if we take these risk estimates from the chronic mortality studies, actually, we can estimate the deaths. The number of deaths, the burden of disease of radon is far higher than the deaths we have from lung cancer in the United States. We are talking about a few thousand lung cancer cases versus few 100,000 deaths, okay? So I think so far, we have been underestimating the total burden of radon on our society. Research, we really need to pay attention to this. We need to replicate the studies. Most of the studies we did were in Massachusetts. I'm talking about the cohort studies with moderate levels. The studies, the mortality, of course, they were from the United States. But if you do these studies in Europe, the levels are very high. We have countries in Europe that they are 2 and 3 times the levels in the United States. Exposure assessment, the studies we did were based on opportunistic studies. We just try to make up things, not make up things, but trying to find all filters, analyze and make hypotheses, etc. I think we need to have better models, spatial temporal models, data collected from studies designed to do exposure assessment. We have been talking about indoor radon. I personally believe that ambient radon is also important, and we have studies to support that. And also in the United States, where we have 1,200,000 fracking wells, and we have 2 papers, there are a tremendous amount of radon that is emitted from this, and we have exposures inside homes. We need to study mitigation studies, strategies, intervention studies, cost-benefit analysis, and new technologies which can be adopted, especially in Europe, that they don't have the single home families the way we have in the United States. Now, my talk focused on cardiovascular and pulmonary effects. I think in the future, we'll see more about brain, immune, and metabolic systems. We have evidence for that. And the very final point I want to make is that radon can really, and we have some limited evidence for that, radon can affect indoor chemistry, physics, and biology. For instance, chemistry can produce ionization, to produce radicals, to produce secondary indoor pollutants. Physical, it can change the charge of particles and affect their deposition in the walls. And biological, it can really kill or help bioaerosols. These studies were not done by me, but they're done by many people that they have really contributed, and it's hard to go and give all the names, but we really appreciate the help of many people. And most of the study has been funded by the Harvard MIT Air and Climate Energy Center. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Koutrakis. I see that there are some questions for you in the QA session, so I leave the word to Laura and Bernd.
Oh, do you want to start?
We don't have much time, so.
Okay. I see that some questions coming in. The first question was from Kevin Stewart. He asked if, on the study with school kids, if you have any effect of the higher indoor radon reflects the poorer ventilation, and hence is likely increased concentration of other indoor pollutants that may also promote inflammation. Did you check this?
Yes, that's true. However, we had a lot of heterogeneity among exposure, among homes, different homes. These kids come from all over Boston, and some of the kids, they live high enough. So in general, we would expect some correlation, of course, winter and summer. But my guess is that, and I don't really have I did not do this, we did not measure other pollutants. But my guess is that not really. I cannot. That pollutant has to be distributed, especially the same way as radon, which I don't expect.
So we have another question from Giorgia Seinelli. Could you please tell us if you know or you have performed studies that have investigated the evidence of radon with neurological diseases?
There was a paper by somebody in the United States many years ago that they suggested they took the radon data and they found Alzheimer's diseases. There was also a study in Minnesota, I don't remember the university, that they took people with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, I don't remember, where they found higher levels of polonium-210, lead and polonium-210 in the brains. So I'm not saying something new. People have been thinking about this kind of aging diseases and radioactivity.
We had next common question from Eric Garshik. Do you think there's a need to measure the immediate short-lived decay products versus the long-lived?
Yeah. I think is the short decay, it's a lot of energy, but for a very short time, okay? So yeah, maybe it's 1,000 times more. The long-lived radionuclides we find inside our brain, if you are exposed when you are 30 years and now you are 80 years old, you will have 50 years of exposure, which so I think both really, I would see the acute effects. This is a speculation, but I think there is some, based on the experience of the analysis we have done, you know, if you take the health effects of particles, and we have the acute effects, that is 1 or 2 days, and then we have the chronic effects. And actually we have an acute standard and a chronic standard. It's very likely that the acute effects are due to the short-lived radiation and the chronic effects are due to the long-lived radiation. It's very, very possible. It's a speculation at this point, but I will not be surprised if that's going to be the story.
So I think there are no questions anymore. I take 2 seconds to remind you that from the 11th of October to the 15th of October, there will be the European Radon Week. Okay, one question coming in.
There is in the chat 16 things in the chat. I don't know what people say in the chat.
No, don't worry.
Okay.
Internal news.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's last question from Deborah. This says similar studies looking at radon in water and aerosolizing into the air.
I'm not, radon is a, drinking water. If you have a well that has uranium, it has been, people have been showing that. And food also in Scandinavia, for instance, people that they eat more reindeer, deer. But again, there is not much literature, but in general, there is kind of the concept that the amount of we retain when we eat something through the GI system is much less as compared to what comes from the particles that go inside your lungs. They go through the epithelium and then they become systemic. So my guess, again, we have very limited data, but if I have to guess, I think the exposures through aerosols and through air are much more significant than the ingestion. Although the quantities might be similar in some cases, but the retention and the life inside the human body, it's going to be much longer. The resistance time is shorter.
And I think there's another question from Eric Peterman. He asked about the radon model. He's impressed about the huge number of indoor radon measurements and related predictors. How was it possible to obtain 100 covariables to about 500,000 measurements? That's a challenge, computational challenge.
Yeah, computation they had to run many days. Yeah, but in terms of the statistical, usually if you have, usually for 10 observations you can have one independent variable. So I think we are not I assume we are not overfitting the model, and we check overfitting, of course, by doing cross validation.
So I think the time at our disposal is finished. I would like to thank again Professor Koutrakis for this very interesting talk. And I'd like to remind you that the registration of this webinar will be available soon on the ERA webpage. And on the ERA webpage, you will also find the program of the rooms meeting that will be during the ERA Radon Week in a few days. We are still waiting for some confirmation from the speakers, so it will be finalized in a few days.
And if you want to talk about particle radioactivity, I can come back and give you another talk.
Okay, that's a very good point. Okay, thank you very much.